The knife was already in my hand before I was fully awake. That is the thing about old training. It does not ask your permission. Your body simply does what it was taught to do, and your mind catches up a second later, blinking in the dark, trying to remember where you are. I was in a servant's closet on the 14th floor of the Athon Royal Palace, and someone had just walked past the door who should not have been there. I pressed my back against the wall and held still. The footsteps were wrong, too light, too careful. The palace staff moved with the easy noise of people who belonged, shoes clicking on marble, carts rattling, voices carrying. These footsteps were the opposite of that. They were the footsteps of someone trying very hard not to exist. My name is Sarah Vale. I have been a maid in this palace for 14 months. Before that, I spent 11 years doing things I am not allowed to describe in places that do not appear on any public map. For a division of Earth's Unified Defense Corps that officially does not exist. I left that life, or it left me, depending on how you want to look at it. I took the posting here because the pay was reasonable, the location was far from anything that reminded me of who I used to be, and because no one looks at the maid. That last part is important. Remember it. The Athon Dominion is one of the 3 great powers in this region of the galaxy. They have been spacefaring for 6,000 years. They look at humans the way you might look at a dog that has learned to use a fork, impressed in a vague, distant way, but not particularly concerned. Their homeworld, Athon Prime, is a place of enormous towers and pale skies, and a culture built on ceremony and hierarchy so layered that even their insults follow protocol. Their royal family is called the Velnara, which roughly translates to the unbroken line. Princess Vela is the 4th daughter of the current sovereign, which means she is important enough to have a palace and a full guard detail, but not so important that the court pays close attention to her. She handles diplomatic relations with lesser treaty worlds. She reads extensively. She drinks her morning tea standing at the window every single day without variation, watching the city below her with the expression of someone who has learned to keep their thoughts very private. I had been assigned to her personal household within my first month. I was told this was because of my work record. I suspect it was also because I was quiet and undemanding, and humans, to the Athon eye, all look more or less the same, which made me easy to overlook. I was fine with that. The Valkyrie were the princess's elite guard. 8 of them, rotated in shifts, each standing close to 2.5 meters tall in their ceremonial armor. The armor was a deep blue-black, edged in silver, and it hummed faintly with the energy of integrated shield plating. They carried long-form pulse lances that could neutralize most threats at range, and short blades of Athon alloy for anything that got close. They had been trained since childhood. They were, by every measurable standard, among the most formidable personal protection units in the Dominion. They were also extremely predictable. I had noticed this within my first week. I had said nothing, because it was not my place, and also because I had not come here to work. I had come here to disappear. But I noticed. I always notice. 11 years of field work rewires the way you see a room. You stop seeing furniture and people and decorations. You start seeing lines of sight, entry points, timing gaps, and the places where attention pools and where it drains away. The Valkyrie rotated on a 90-minute cycle, precisely timed. They changed posts in pairs, which meant there was a 40-second window at each transition, when the overlap created a brief blind spot near the eastern servant corridor. They did not guard the linen storage on the 14th floor, because no one of consequence had ever used it. Their armor's sensors were calibrated for armed threats above a certain mass threshold, which meant they pinged for Athon-sized bodies and most known alien combatants, and largely ignored beings of human size and density as background noise. I had filed none of this away for any particular purpose. It was just the way my mind worked. It cataloged without being asked. The footsteps outside the closet door had stopped. I waited. 3 seconds. 5. Then they moved again, continuing down the corridor toward the far stairwell. I let out a slow breath and stayed where I was for another full minute, counting. Then I opened the closet door 1 centimeter and looked. The corridor was empty. But on the floor, just at the edge of the light, was a small pressed mark in the carpet. The kind of mark a narrow, non-standard boot sole leaves. Not palace staff footwear. Not Valkyrie armor boots, which leave a very distinctive impression. Something else. I looked at that mark for a long time. Then I went back to my room, sat on the edge of my cot, and thought about the supply shipment that had arrived 3 days ago. It had come in through the lower loading dock, which was standard. It had been logged and cleared, which was also standard. What was not standard was the routing code on 2 of the crates. I had caught it by accident while signing off on the linen inventory. The code was close to correct, but not exact. 1 digit off from the authorized supplier's registered mark. The kind of thing you would never notice unless you had spent time learning to read forgery markers in shipping documents, which I had, during a particularly thorough 8-week course in the spring of my 3rd operational year. I had flagged it to the Velkari captain, Commander Rethak, the following morning. He had looked at me the way most Athan look at humans when we speak about security matters. It is not quite contempt. It is more like the patient expression you give a child who has drawn a picture of something and is explaining, with great seriousness, what it represents. He told me the shipment had been cleared by Palace Logistics and that my concern, while noted, was not actionable. He said the word noted, the way people say it when they mean disregarded. I had gone back to folding linens. But I had also, quietly, on my own time, gone down to the lower storage level and looked at those 2 crates. They had already been opened and the contents distributed. Cleaning compounds and replacement light panels, according to the manifest. The crates themselves were empty, but the inner lining of one of them had a faint residue along the seam that I recognized from a technical briefing I had attended years ago. A briefing about how small communication relay devices were concealed in shipments to avoid sensor sweeps. I had not taken that information to Commander Rethak again. I had thought about it for 2 days, and then I had started sleeping in the linen closet on the 14th floor, which was adjacent to the princess's private corridor, 3 nights a week. My fellow staff thought I was odd. I was already odd to them by baseline, being human, so this did not change their opinion of me significantly. The pressed mark on the carpet troubled me more than I wanted to admit. It meant someone had been in this corridor tonight who did not belong here, and who was moving in a way that suggested they knew exactly where the Velkari were posted, and exactly where they were not. I looked at my knife. It was a kitchen blade, taken from the palace culinary stores. Not elegant, entirely functional. Then I looked at the corridor again and thought about the princess, 2 doors down, sleeping with the calm certainty of someone who believed that the 8 armored warriors stationed outside her suite were an impenetrable wall between her and anything that might wish her harm. I thought about the supply crate residue. I thought about the routing code. I thought about the footsteps that knew where to be quiet. I did not go back to sleep. I sat down against the wall with my back to solid stone and my knife resting across my knees, and I waited for morning, and I thought about all the things that were adding up to something no one else in this palace seemed to be counting. There is a particular kind of alertness that comes from spending years in environments where the cost of missing something is permanent. It does not turn off when you leave those environments. It sits in you like a low current, always running, reading the room, noting the small wrong things that most people's minds smooth over because their minds were never trained to catch them. I had tried, in the 14 months since I arrived here, to quiet that current, to let the routine of palace work settle over me like something peaceful, to fold the linens and polish the surfaces and exist in the ordinary. But the ordinary had something hidden in it now, and my body had known it before my mind did, which is why the knife had been in my hand before I was fully awake. I stayed in that corridor until the first gray light of morning pressed through the high window at the end of the hall, and the palace began its gentle noise of waking, and the Velkari changed their morning shift with their precise and predictable 90-minute timing. And somewhere below us, in the levels of the palace that the guards did not watch because nothing important had ever happened there, something that had arrived in a shipping crate was waiting. I was the only one who knew it, and I was just the maid. 3 days after the night in the corridor, I found the first device. It was inside the ventilation housing on the east wall of the princess's sitting room, tucked behind the filter panel with a precision that told me whoever placed it had done this before, and had done it in a hurry. The device itself was small enough to sit in the center of my palm, flat, matte-surfaced, with a faint iridescent quality to the casing that I recognized as Kethar manufacture. The Kethar Syndicate was a mercenary organization operating out of the outer reaches. They were known for 2 things: clean contracts and no survivors. They did not take personal protection work. They did not do politics. They did purely contractual elimination, and they were expensive enough that only governments and very old money could afford to use them. Someone with that kind of resource had put a surveillance device in Princess Vela's sitting room. I held the device in my hand for a long moment. Then I put the filter panel back exactly as I had found it, replaced the ventilation housing, and went back to folding the morning linens on the side table. Viola was at her window. She was always at her window in the morning, standing with her tea in both hands, watching the city. She was tall by human standards, slender, with the silver pale skin of the Athon, and eyes that shifted color between blue and gray depending on the light. She rarely spoke to me beyond the necessary requests of the morning routine. This was not unfriendliness. It was simply the Athon way. Staff were staff. There was a protocol for everything, and casual conversation with your maid was not part of it. But that morning, as I moved to gather the previous day's linens, she spoke. "You have been watching the guard rotation," she said. Not an accusation, simply an observation, offered in the same tone she might use to mention the weather. I stopped moving. "Your Highness?" "For the past several days," she said, still looking out the window, "I have noticed you pausing at the corridor entrances, timing something. You do not do it, obviously, but I have learned to watch things that are not obvious." She turned from the window and looked at me with those color-shifting eyes. "What are you timing?" The correct response, the safe response, the response that kept me invisible and unimportant and no one's problem, was to apologize and say I had been making sure not to interrupt the guard changes. A small lie, totally believable. I looked at her for a moment and made a different choice. "The gaps," I said. "There is a 40-second window in the Eastern Corridor transition, where the coverage is incomplete, and a similar gap near the lower stairwell access, which does not appear to be monitored at all between the second and third shift change." Vela was quiet. She set her tea down. "I see," she said. "I reported a concern about a supply shipment several days ago to Commander Rethak," I said. "He did not find it worth investigating. I believe he was wrong." She looked at me for a long time. With most of the Athon I had encountered, long silences meant dismissal was coming. With Vela, I was not sure. "You are the human maid," she said slowly. "Sarah." "Yes, Your Highness." "You were with the palace household for 14 months before this assignment." "Yes." "And before that?" I met her eyes. "Work I cannot describe in detail, Your Highness. Work that involved learning to notice things like routing code irregularities in shipping manifests, and recognizing ventilation housing panels that have been removed and replaced recently." Another long silence. "The East sitting room panel," she said quietly. She had noticed that too. I felt something shift in my assessment of her. She was not simply a ceremonial princess watching the city from a window. She had seen the panel and said nothing, waiting, watching to see what I would do. "Yes," I said. "Did you remove what was inside it?" "No. Removing it would alert whoever placed it that it had been found. As long as it is there and silent, they believe their intelligence operation is intact." She picked up her tea again. Her hands were completely steady. "And how many such devices do you believe there are in this suite?" "At minimum 2, likely 3. The sitting room, the corridor junction near your sleeping chamber, and possibly the secondary reception room. Those are the locations I would choose if I were mapping surveillance for an operation that needed to know your movements in advance." Viola was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough to make me wonder if I had badly miscalculated. Then she said, "What do you need?" The question surprised me, not because it was the wrong question. It was exactly the right question. It surprised me because she asked it without hesitation, without reaching for Commander Rethak, without defaulting to the protocol that said humans who raised security concerns should be thanked and redirected to the appropriate authority. She asked what I needed, and she meant it. "Time," I said, "and your trust, which I understand I have not yet earned." "You have been in my household for 5 weeks," she said. "In that time, you have been consistently early, consistently thorough, and consistently quiet, in a way that I have learned to distinguish from the quiet of indifference. You are quiet in the way of someone who is paying attention to everything." She looked at me steadily. "That is not nothing." I nodded once. "Then I need 2 things, Your Highness. First, I need you to continue your routine exactly as normal. Every morning at the window, every evening reading in the sitting room, every movement at its usual time. Whoever placed those devices is watching your pattern and building a timeline. We do not want them to know the timeline has changed. And second, I need you to not tell Commander Rethak what I am doing. That was the riskier ask. Asking a princess to withhold information from her own elite guard captain was either very brave or very foolish, and I was not entirely sure which it was yet. Viola looked at the window, then back at me. Rethak is loyal, she said. He is not negligent or corrupt. He is simply certain that his assessment of threats is superior to any humans. I know, I said, and that certainty is itself the vulnerability. If he knows I am investigating, he will involve himself in ways that will be visible to whoever is watching through those devices. Right now, the watchers see a princess with her maid. I need it to stay that way. She was quiet again. Outside, the city moved in its morning rhythms. Far below, I could hear the distant sound of the Velkari shift change, perfectly on time, as it always was. All right, Sarah, she said finally. She used my name without the title for the first time, and there was something in it that felt like a door opening. Do what you need to do. I will not speak to Rethak. I spent the rest of that morning locating the second device. It was exactly where I had predicted, in the corridor junction near the sleeping chamber, pressed into the corner of a decorative wall panel, with a sealant compound that matched the wall color almost perfectly. Almost. In certain light, at certain angles, you could see the seam. I did not touch it. I photographed it with a personal device I carried in my uniform pocket, made sure the photograph would not transmit to any network, and moved on. I spent my off hours differently after that. I had been given a standard rest period of 4 hours each afternoon, which the palace considered generous by Athen household standards. I used these hours to walk the servant levels of the palace. Every corridor I was permitted access to, I walked. I learned the sound of each floor, the pattern of traffic, the locations of the storage rooms and the maintenance accesses, and the stairwells that connected floors without passing the main guard posts. I also learned the palace staff with new attention. 14 months of working here had given me a broad familiarity with the household's 240-odd members. Now I was looking at them differently. Not with suspicion toward any one person, but with the specific attention of someone looking for the small behavioral markers that indicate stress, changed routine, or concealment. On the 4th day of this, I found what I was looking for. His name was Divan, a young attaché in the administrative division, who had worked in the palace for just under a year. He was quiet, efficient, and unremarkable. He had begun taking his evening meal in the eastern courtyard 3 weeks ago, which was unusual because the eastern courtyard was exposed to the wind at that hour, and most staff preferred the warmth of the inner dining hall. He ate quickly and walked back through the lower corridor instead of the main staff passage, which added 4 minutes to his route back to the administrative wing for no apparent reason. He also, 3 days ago, had changed the location of his personal data pad from his left breast pocket, where he had always carried it, to his right hip pocket. A small thing, the kind of thing you only notice if you have been watching someone's habits long enough to know what normal looks like for them. I noted all of this and said nothing. On the 6th day after my conversation with Viola, I found the third device. It was not in the secondary reception room, as I had guessed. It was in Viola's sleeping chamber itself, tucked inside the base of the reading lamp beside her bed. It was more sophisticated than the others, smaller, newer manufacture. The kind of device that does not just listen, it also watches. I stood in that room for a long moment, with the weight of what I was holding settling through me. This was not a surveillance operation to gather political intelligence. The level of coverage, the placement, the Kethar manufacture markers I had identified on the first device. This was the groundwork for something that was going to happen soon, and it was going to happen in this room or very close to it. And whoever was planning it had been watching and timing and preparing for weeks, while the 8 most formidable warriors in the Dominion stood at their posts and ran their rotations and knew nothing about any of it. I replaced the lamp base exactly as I had found it. Then I went to the kitchen and requested an assignment to the evening catering team for the diplomatic reception that was scheduled for 10 days from now. The kitchen supervisor, a large, stern Athen named Velis, looked at me with some surprise. Maids did not typically request extra kitchen assignments. "Why?" she asked. "I am told the reception will require additional linen management throughout the evening," I said. "I would like to be available for that." She gave me the assignment without further question. I had 8 days. I also had a kitchen knife that I had quietly assessed for balance and edge quality and found acceptable. I had the muscle memory of 11 years of work that my body had not forgotten even if I had been doing my best to let it sleep. I had a map of every servant corridor in the palace drawn from personal observation, and I had the gap in the east corridor transition that no one but me had thought to measure. I did not have weapons. I did not have backup. I did not have the authority to do anything I was planning to do, and if I was wrong about all of this, I would lose the safest and most unremarkable life I had managed to build in the wreckage of the one that came before it. I was not wrong. I have never once in my life wanted to be right about something less. I spent the days that followed doing the one thing that most people, in that situation, would not have done. I slept, properly, 7 hours a night, in the linen closet or my own cot, because sleep is a tool just like everything else, and the body you will need in 10 days has to be rested to function at the level that surviving this was going to demand. I also ate well. I exercised in my room each morning before the palace woke, the quiet kind of exercise that does not require space or noise, the kind that keeps the tendons flexible and the reaction speed dialed in without advertising itself. I drank water. I stretched. I reviewed what I knew. Kethar Syndicate. 4 or 5 operatives, based on the surveillance architecture, which was sized for a coordinated entry rather than a lone actor. They would come through the servant corridors, because the servant corridors were the only unmonitored approach to the princess's floor. They would come during the reception, because the reception would pull Valkyrie attention to the public areas and give the diplomatic noise of a busy palace evening as cover. They would have a way to deal with the guards' communication systems, because the comm jammer components that I had identified from the crate residue were designed for exactly that kind of targeted signal suppression. They had planned this with care. They had an inside source who had given them the routing information and the guard schedules. They believed they were invisible. They did not know about me, because nobody ever knows about the maid. On the evening of the diplomatic reception, I reported to the kitchen at the assigned hour. I loaded my linen cart, adjusted the kitchen knife in the deep pocket of my uniform, and walked to the service elevator. Commander Rethak passed me in the main corridor, as his unit moved toward the reception hall in their formal ceremonial arrangement, all 8 of them, gleaming and precise and magnificent, and facing entirely the wrong direction. He did not look at me. I watched him go, and I pushed my cart toward the service elevator, and I went to work. The reception hall on the 3rd floor was bright and loud, and full of the kind of organized political ceremony that the Aethan Dominion did better than almost anyone. Dignitaries from 4 treaty worlds moved through the space in their formal dress, attended by their own protocol officers and staff. The music was a traditional Aethon form that moved in long, slow waves of sound, the kind designed to make conversation feel significant. Vaela stood near the central reception area in a formal gown the color of deep water, speaking with a delegation from Sereth Minor, with the composed, practiced manner of someone who had been doing this since childhood. She caught my eye across the room as I moved through with the linen cart, replacing the table arrangements near the east service entrance. Just for a moment, her expression did not change. Mine did not either. I moved through the service entrance and let the door close behind me. The corridor beyond it was quiet. I pushed the cart to the service alcove at the corridor junction, positioned it to block the sight line from the camera housing at the ceiling corner, and waited. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, the lights in the corridor dimmed by 40%, and then returned to normal. A single pulse, half a second long. That was the signal footprint of a targeted comm suppression activation. The Valkyrie's armor systems would have just gone dark. I did not have time to think about what that meant in terms of whether they were aware of it, or what Vaela was doing at that moment in the reception hall, or any of the other things that existed outside the scope of the next several minutes. I picked up the knife and moved toward the eastern stairwell. They were already in the corridor above me. I heard them at the turn of the stairwell, 4 of them moving fast and quiet, wearing close-fit tactical suits in dark gray that were designed for exactly this kind of enclosed operation. They were Kethar, which meant they were not Athon tall, but not human small either. They averaged somewhere around 2 meters, lean and fast, with the particular kind of movement that comes from training built on speed and precision. Each of them carried a short-bladed tool that I recognized as a neurotoxin delivery weapon. Efficient, clean, very quick. The one in front saw me at the same moment I saw them. For a fraction of a second, we both stopped. Then I threw the linen cart directly at the first two and went right. The cart hit them hard enough to break the formation, and I did not wait to see how they recovered, because I was already moving up the corridor toward the wall junction where the ceiling was lower, significantly lower, because this was a servant corridor built for beings of human height, and the Kethar operatives were not built for this geometry. The third one came around the cart fast and reached for me, and I was not where he expected me to be, which is the only meaningful advantage a human has against a faster opponent in a closed space. I was lower than he calculated. I ducked the reach, drove into his center, and used the wall as leverage. He went down hard against the stone, and I did not give him time to come back up. 2 more were moving. I hit the door release for the maintenance access, went through it, and came out on the other side of the corridor 30 meters ahead of where they expected me to be. The fourth operative was waiting at the junction outside Vela's suite, and he was not expecting me to come from behind him. I had 2 seconds of his confusion. I used both of them. He went down. One of the first 2 was still moving at the far end of the corridor, and I could hear the second one somewhere close in the maintenance access, coming through. My left arm had taken damage at the junction, a glancing contact with the wall during the scramble that had done something unpleasant to the shoulder joint, the kind of thing that does not hurt immediately, because the body's emergency chemistry is still running, but would hurt considerably later. My hand was still working. That was what mattered right now. The door to Vela's suite was 30 feet ahead. It was open. I had not heard it open, which meant either it had been unlocked with a code that someone had provided to the operation, or one of the first 2 had gotten past me during the maintenance access detour, which I had been afraid of. I moved to the door. The suite was dim, the lights at their low evening setting. The reception room was empty. The corridor to the sleeping chamber was not. The last operative, the one I had not accounted for, the one who had gotten through the maintenance access while I was dealing with the others, was standing in the sleeping chamber doorway with his neurotoxin blade at Vela's throat. Vela was completely still. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was the composed face of someone who had decided not to show fear because fear would not help her. The operative looked at me. He was injured, I could see that, from the cart or the fall or something in between, but he was standing, and he was holding the blade, and it was angled in a way that allowed very little margin for the kind of action that ends with Vela uninjured. He said something in the Kethar trade dialect that I did not fully understand, but that had the cadence of an instruction. Stop. Stay back. Something like that. I looked at him. I looked at Vela. I looked at the doorway dimensions, the angle of his stance, the way his injured side was favoring his left, the way the blade hand was slightly extended from his body to maintain the angle, which meant his grip stability was reduced compared to a close hold position. I did the calculation. There is a concept in combat that most training programs teach, and most people apply incorrectly. It is the idea of the unexpected action. The theory is that a sufficiently unexpected response disrupts an opponent's decision tree because their mind is already running a model of what they think you will do, and reality suddenly does not match the model. When that happens, there is a pause, a fraction of a second, sometimes less. That pause is a door. The mistake most people make is trying to be unpredictable in a complex way. A big movement, a sudden shout, something designed to startle. The most effective version is simpler. I sat down on the floor. Not fell, not stumbled. Deliberately, smoothly, cross-legged on the corridor floor, as though I had just decided this was a fine place to rest. The operative's model broke. I saw it in his face. Everything he had been running, threat assessment, response prediction, exit planning, stuttered for approximately 1.2 seconds, while his mind scrambled to reframe what a human sitting down in a corridor meant in this context. Viola had been watching me since I came through the door. She understood. She had known me for weeks now, and she had looked at me. Really looked, and she understood. She moved in the same moment I did. She stepped into the blade instead of away from it, taking the angle herself, turning into his body the way I had shown her in a very brief, very quiet conversation 2 days ago, when I had told her only that if something happened, and she had any moment of choice, she should do the unexpected thing, and trust me to read it. She trusted me. The blade missed. I was already off the floor. It was over in 11 seconds. The palace was very quiet afterward. The silence after the last operative went down was the loudest silence I had experienced in years. Viola was standing in the sleeping chamber doorway with both hands pressed flat against the frame, steadying herself. She was not injured. There was a very small mark on the side of her neck where the blade had been near enough to leave a line, thin as thread. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, not relief exactly. Something more complex than either. The look of a person who has just watched the world rearrange itself around a fact they are still processing. I was sitting on the corridor floor again, not deliberately this time, because my left shoulder had decided to make its full complaint known, and my legs had agreed with it. My right hand was still holding the kitchen knife, which I set carefully down beside me on the marble. "Sarah," Vela said. "I am all right," I said, which was largely true. "Are you?" She came out of the doorway and crossed the corridor, and knelt beside me in her formal reception gown, which cost more than I earned in 6 months, and she did not appear to care about that at all. She looked at my shoulder with clinical attention. "This needs medical care." "In a moment," I said. "The comm suppression will have worn off by now. The Velkari will have received alerts. They will be here within the next 2 minutes." "Then we should be ready for that," she said. She did not move from where she was kneeling. "I need to tell you something before they arrive." I looked at her. 2 weeks ago, she said quietly, I noticed the lamp base in my sleeping chamber had been disturbed. I said nothing because I was not certain, and because I was not certain what to do. 3 days ago, I was certain. I went to Commander Rethak. She paused. He told me I was experiencing elevated stress responses associated with my diplomatic workload, and that I should rest. I absorbed this. He dismissed you. He was very polite about it. I almost laughed. I held it back because my shoulder made the movement painful. "What did you do?" "I came to you," she said, in a manner of speaking. I waited. "I watched you do what you were doing without telling you I could see it, because I needed to know if you were real." She looked at me steadily. "You are real." Footsteps were coming down the corridor. Heavy, armored, fast. The Velkari, responding to the alert their systems had finally been able to send. I heard Commander Rethak's voice calling the princess's name, the tightly controlled volume of a person who is afraid and will not show it. "Here," Viola called back, calm and clear. They came around the corridor junction and stopped, all 8 of them, in their full armor, with their pulse lances active, looking at a princess in a formal gown kneeling beside a human maid on a corridor floor, surrounded by 4 incapacitated Kethar Syndicate operatives. Commander Rethak surveyed the scene. He surveyed it for a long time. His face cycled through several expressions, none of which he fully completed. Then he looked at me. I looked back at him. "The communication suppression device," I said, "is in the lower storage level, inside the lining of a supply crate that arrived 11 days ago. I reported that crate to you at the time. The surveillance devices are in the sitting room ventilation housing, the corridor junction panel, and the sleeping chamber lamp base. You will want to have them removed, now that the operation has ended." I paused. "Also, there is a 4th operative somewhere in the maintenance access between the 14th floor eastern corridor and the service junction. He may need medical attention." Rethak was quiet for a moment. Then he said to 2 of his unit, "Go." They went. He looked back at me. There was something in his expression that I did not have a category for immediately. It was not the polite patience he had shown me when I reported the shipping crate. It was not contempt or dismissal. It was something that sat closer to the expression of a person who has just realized the shape of a mistake they made. "The routing code on the supply manifest," he said. "You came to me about that?" "Yes." I should have listened. "Yes," I said again. I said it without weight, without bitterness. It was simply true. He had not listened, and here we were, and people who had come to eliminate the princess were now on the floor of her corridor. And the only reason that was the outcome was that I had been paying attention in the dark when no one knew to look. He straightened. He looked at Vela, who was still kneeling beside me, which seemed to require some internal adjustment on his part, because it was not protocol, and he was a person who understood the world through protocol. Your Highness, are you uninjured? I am, she said. Sarah requires medical attention for her shoulder. Immediately, please. He called the medical unit. He also called the Palace Security Division and the senior intelligence officer on duty, and within the next 30 minutes, the corridor was populated with a significant number of people, conducting a significant number of conversations. I sat through most of it with my back against the wall and let Vela manage them, which she did with a composure that I had come to recognize as the real thing, rather than performance. At some point, the palace medic arrived and did things to my shoulder that were professionally effective and personally unpleasant, and I held still and focused on the ceiling and thought about the fact that I was still here, which was not something I had spent a great deal of time calculating odds on during the past hour. The intelligence officer, a senior Athen official named Lethas, interviewed me for 40 minutes. He was precise and thorough, and asked good questions. I answered all of them accurately. I told him about the crate residue, the routing code, the 3 surveillance devices, my assessment of the Kethar operative count and method, and the inside source that I had identified, but not yet confirmed by name. When I mentioned the inside source, he leaned forward slightly. You have a candidate? Davan, I said. Administrative division. Behavioral changes consistent with the timeline of the operations setup. Meal location shift. Route changes. A personal device moved to a different pocket 3 days ago. He has had access to scheduled documents that would have given the operatives the guard rotation timing and the reception date. Lethas wrote this down. He then looked at me for a moment. You have been working as a maid, he said, not as an accusation. As a fact, he was trying to reconcile with other facts. Yes, I said. How long have you been observing security protocols in this palace? Since my first week. And you brought concerns to Commander Rethak. Once, he did not find them actionable. He wrote that down too. Then he closed his notes and said, in the careful tone of someone choosing their words, this will require a significant internal review. I imagine it will, I said. He left. Others came and went. Vela moved through all of it with the steady efficiency of someone who had inherited the ability to function in chaos at a high altitude, which royalty often did whether they wanted to or not. Late in the evening, when the corridor had finally quieted, and the last of the official personnel had moved their work to other parts of the palace, Vela came back to where I was sitting. The medical team had relocated me to a small chair beside the sitting room door. My shoulder was bound, and the medic had given me something for the pain that was working reasonably well. She sat across from me in the other chair, the one she usually used when she was reading. She had changed out of the formal gown. She looked tired, which was the first time I had seen that on her face. Real tiredness, the kind that comes after something has finally ended. Davan, she said. He was in my household's administrative division. Yes. He was competent, quiet. I had no reason to suspect him. He was careful, I said. It takes time to see careful. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing its nighttime things, the lights moving in the streets far below, the ordinary life of a place that did not know what had happened in the corridors above it tonight. I want to ask you something, Viola said, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it will be accepted. I waited. I know that you came here to be invisible, she said. I know that whatever work you did before this, the work you cannot describe, I know it ended in a way that sent you looking for somewhere quiet. I am not going to ask about it. It is not mine to ask about. She paused. But I am going to ask what you want now. Not what you are assigned to, not what protocol requires. What you want. I looked at her. No one had asked me that in a very long time. I had not asked it of myself either. I had been so focused on the not being found, the not being known, the not being anywhere that mattered, that the question of what I actually wanted had become one I did not think was available to me anymore. I don't know yet, I said, which was honest. Then stay, she said, until you do. Not as a maid, not as a guard, because Rethak would find that complicated. and I do not want to give him more complications tonight. Just as what you are, whatever that turns out to be. I thought about the linen closet on the 14th floor where I had spent 3 nights a week sitting against the wall with a kitchen knife on my knees. I thought about the routing code on the supply manifest that nobody had cared about except me. I thought about the footstep mark in the carpet and the 2 days of calculation that had led me to the maintenance access shortcut and the 11 seconds that had followed. I thought about Vela kneeling beside me in a gown that cost more than I earned in 6 months, not caring about any of that, asking what I needed. "All right," I said. She nodded, as though this was settled, and looked out the window at the city below, and I looked with her, and neither of us said anything else for a while. Somewhere below us, in a holding facility that had been arranged very quickly by Lethas's people, 4 Kethar operatives were waiting for the kind of questions that were going to take a long time to answer. Devon had been located in his quarters an hour ago, still dressed in his evening clothes, with a personal comm device that contained exactly the information that Lethas needed. The operations client would be identified, there would be proceedings. There would be a long, involved process of accountability and reform that would occupy a great many important people for a great many months. The Velkari would revise their protocols. Commander Rethak would have a different relationship with information that came from unexpected sources. The palace supply chain would be audited. A lot of things would change. None of that was mine to manage. It would happen, or it would not, and people better positioned than me would handle it. What I had, tonight, was this room, and this window, and a princess who had knelt on a marble floor, in a gown that cost more than I earned in 6 months, because that was where I was, and who had not once suggested that the maid who had solved the problem she had been told did not exist was anything less than what she was. I flexed my right hand, the one that had held the kitchen knife. The fingers were stiff but working. Old training. It does not ask your permission. But sometimes, if you are lucky, it puts you exactly where you need to be. I stayed.